Social inequality.
This is NPR. Mumbai.
Of each of us. So I will pass the mic to one of our first interlocutor. So tell us who you are and what you study.
My name is Billy Wilson. I'm a fourth year anthropology major at Northeastern University, and I study climate change and anthropology and equality.
My name is Jonna, and I am the director of the University Scholars Program, and I'm here to moderate our discussion today.
Hello everyone, my name is Krishna. I am a PhD research scholar at IIT Bombay. My research focuses on climate change, adaptation and mitigation.
Sorry about this awkward handling of the mic, but hopefully you'll bear with us as we try to have this discussion. So today, just to frame the conversation a little bit, we're going to be trying to plumb the depths of Krishna's knowledge, as well as Billy's, relative to issues surrounding sustainable development in emerging economies, and whether or not climate change should be a priority for these communities. And so I'm just going to begin with sort of a question for Krishna. One of the major questions in international debates about climate change has revolved around the question of historical emissions. People seem to say, from an Indian perspective, potential here, that India should be responsible for its CO2 emissions because the West has, in developing, utilized an enormous amount of CO2. Where do you think that perspective comes from, and what type of weight do you think it holds from your perspective?
This perspective can be justified, but it's a delicate balance, 50-50. It can be justified partially because yes, India has started developing very late compared to the West, and whatever climate change is happening right now, it's attributed to previous carbon dioxide emissions that had begun from the Industrial Revolution back in Europe in the 19th century. So yeah, partially this claim of India can be justified, but when we look at a problem from the perspective of a global population as a unified, like all people belonging to every country or any other, without seeing boundaries, then we just can't throw accusations that you have been doing that, so we won't do it right now, because the suffering, whatever impacts will happen, they will impact at a global level. It's not that since the West has been doing that, so only the West will be harmed. In fact, the developing countries will be harmed more because they lack the institutional capability, financial capabilities to adapt to climate change. So they are more vulnerable, and in the future years also, they would be more vulnerable. So we just can't throw accusations on one another. India should also start giving their inputs to tackling this problem. But still, we just can't say that to tackle this climate change problem, we would completely stop emitting carbon dioxide emissions, because India too has to develop. Otherwise, the vulnerability will increase in the future. If India's whatever state India is now currently, if it continues to if it becomes stagnant, then it will become more vulnerable. It has to develop like the West, so that its vulnerability is decreased. But unlike the West, who has just went on developing without considering the environment, since India now knows that what are the consequences of development, it has to choose a low carbon trajectory for development, so that they can contribute to climate change mitigation. So mitigation and development has to go hand in hand. Since we know already now the global stage is that we know the consequences of carbon dioxide emissions, so India shouldn't be tactless. They should handle development considering climate change impacts. They should prove as an example of a coming. India has a good economic development trajectory, unlike other developing countries like Bangladesh or Sri Lanka. India is much more. India is now trying to prove to be a upcoming developing country. They don't want to be considered as a third world country. That's why they have even stopped taking international funding whenever there is a disaster, like when there was this felling disaster in Orissa. They deny international funding. They say that we'll be able to handle this on our own. So so India should try to set an example to developing countries that see we are developing, but we are also considering climate change impacts, and we'll try to mitigate the problem.
That's a very sort of fully fleshed answer. That seems, the way that you're phrasing it is sort of as an Indian ideal. In your experience, how has the actual implementation of sustainability initiatives worked? I know that in one of our conversations you talked about some of the, I guess you would say, how the vulnerable have fared with these policies. Can you give us a little bit of insight into how that has worked? Yeah.
Climate change discussion started back in 1990s. So from that point of time, India has been quite defensive that no, developing country, we are developing countries, we have not developed yet till now, so we should be allowed to emit as much carbon dioxide emissions that can be, because we have to develop. But with incoming of good politicians, educated politicians since 2008, there has been talks of climate change action mitigation plans, and they have been formulated, but they are at a very nascent stage. They haven't been implemented fully. India has 5-year plans. This is the 12th 5-year plan running from 2012 to 2017. So in that also, India has tried to focus on increasing the share of renewables in their electricity sector. But yes, compared to other developed countries like Europe, Germany has the highest percentage of renewables in their electricity grid. So India has not been able to do so, maybe because of financial problems or technological problems. But India is trying. It's trying. I would not be able to comment if it is the best or not. If they are trying at their best. But they are trying, and it has started since 2008. So it's quite early for me to judge that, okay, they are not trying well, or they are trying their best, or they are trying 50-50. I won't be able to comment, but processes are on stage. And that's the mitigation part. In case of adaptation also, like providing irrigation or generating awareness among people about climate change, that's also been in process. I took a master's in environmental science because of these awareness programs. Maybe I can because of the media, saying that India is going to this conference of parties in these different parts of the world, and stating their agenda status on the issue of climate change. Because of that, there has been a media uproar. Maybe it's not that much as in the West, like in the US. Al Gore is very popular in the US, I know, because of that documentary called The Inconvenient Truth. It has not been that much at a large scale, but India, everything is under process. Many of things has been listed in the climate change action plans. Almost many of the states in India now have climate change action plans, because in 2008 the central government directed every state that they need to have a climate change action plan, and many states have done that. They have listed out things that can be done to adapt or mitigate to climate change, like including renewables, fuel switching. Delhi underwent complete fuel switching back in the last decade because they knew that we would be contributing later to the climate change problem. So the efforts are in process, but they are probably not being accelerated to that much because Delhi is the only not there are only a few cities in India, for example, who have gone for fuel switching. It would be good if the entire country could have gone, and then we would have said, yes, India is trying very hard, it's trying 100%. But I can't say that because only a few cities in India have gone for fuel switching, and there are other mitigation things or mitigation programs or adaptation programs that have been implemented partially. They are fully on paper, but implementation is quite low. But I can just say that it's in process and India is trying.
Well, India is trying, which is probably a lot better than we might be able to say in the United States. So I had a question for you that revolves around that same area. So Krishna has suggested that India has plans. In your studies, it seems that you are studying areas of the world where plans have been implemented. I was wondering if you could share with us some of what you've learned relative to how those implemented plans have ended up serving or not serving vulnerable populations.
It seems pretty normal for developing countries such as Brazil or India to receive giant loans from international financial institutions like the World Bank or the IMF to tell them that they want to adopt a green economy by building for instance large-scale dams and to be perceived by the rest of the world as a green economy. Brazil, for instance, generates 80% of its electricity just from renewable sources, and 60% of it is renewably, or it's from hydroelectric dams. So they're big with dam development, but it's, what a lot of folks don't really understand is, or we don't really hear about, except for when you hear about mobilization movements in Sao Paulo or Rio, that there's a lot of displacement that goes on just in terms of flooding these dams. The second largest dam in the world, the Itapu, it flooded 2,000 square kilometers and ended up displacing 50,000 refugees, mostly who don't get compensated. And then right now, for instance, they're in the process of building the Belmonte Dam, which is supposed to be the world's third largest dam. And so there's this displacement that goes on, but at the same time, the dam is to generate electricity, and so you're like, okay, well let's ask where the electricity is going to go. It's going to go for the rural populations or the urban slum areas, where it's going to go, and most of it ends up going to aluminum smelters. So dam or power generation sources are put in place. It seems just to simply build build the economy that's in a country where a high Gini coefficient is. So you have the people at the very top tier who are actually benefiting from these renewable sources, and then there comes to the idea of is this environmentally sustaining or is it environmentally exploitating? I know there are some dams in Brazil that will produce 11 times the amount of greenhouse gases than a coal operating equivalent, and so it isn't just the lower underbelly that gets tucked under the rug, but also just the environment as well. But this is the same. This happens in India too. Since the 70s, along the Narmada River, there was a project, and still it goes on, to build 3,000 dams, and a lot of them are large ones. And I know that a big one is the Sardar Sarovar, and what it ended up doing is displaced 20,000, and with a lot of agriculture, land just go underwater, and so there's a lot of an inundation, and then it's a multi-purpose dam, so it generates electricity but also provides irrigation. And the Indian government will tell the World Bank that it's meant to generate this amount of power while only displacing this amount of people. And after further inspection, representatives of the World Bank found that this isn't the case. It isn't able to reach its capacity. The politicians overvalued it just to have a good sell, and they're actually displacing much more folks than were originally intended. mostly because of the irrigation system meant to bring water to industries and urban centers.
So it seems as if it's neither meeting environmental needs nor particularly developmental needs within Brazil. During one of our conversations, you had mentioned one small-scale sustainability issue, rather sustainability gadget, stoves. And yesterday we were at Sitara and we saw sort of small-scale stoves. You've been, I think, hedging your bets a little bit here. Can you, in our earlier conversation, you were a little bit more volatile about what you thought of initiatives that aimed for that low-hanging fruit, so to speak. Can you speak a little bit about that? Maybe, about what you think about these sort of low-emission stoves and versus what you feel the aims of development should be?
Like I had said earlier, India is a vast country and diverse kind of people stay over here. And it's questionable when you say that, okay, these people are now using biomass for cooking and other kind of needs, energy needs. And the government or the government of India or these NGOs take funds from international communities and say that yes, now just to so that they don't use biomass directly, which is lesser efficient and it also causes air pollution. We'll be providing them with more efficient stove, but they are going to use biomass as the fuel. It's the same thing, but it's just that the stoves will be more efficient and there will be lesser of air pollution. So it's questionable, and sometimes people say, why not provide these people with LPG, liquefied petroleum gas that urban people use, rather than putting your money in providing them with more efficient gas stoves. Why not put more money into R&D, research and development, such that you can provide them some other kind of fuel or stove, which doesn't use biomass. So you are saying, okay, the urban people should have access to LPG and the poor people shouldn't have access to LPG. They should go on, continue using biomass, but it's just that we'll be providing more efficient stoves and less polluting stoves. So it's questionable. But there are other questions also which justifies that, okay, we have to provide, because we can't subsidize LPG for poor people. Some economists would say that. So it's a big debate actually. Okay, should we subsidize LPG for these people so that they can stop using biomass, or we should just provide them with gas stoves which are more efficient so that they have to use lesser of biomass, and also it would impact their health less. Because biomass produces a lot of smoke and ash, and air pollution is a big problem in rural areas even. If you see at satellite images, then India and China has black carbon all over the country, probably mostly in the rural pockets because of emissions of black carbon and this ash, smoke from this biomass. So it's debatable actually. From their perspective, it might seem that why, because they question when you go to rural areas and you give this stove to them. Some people question why isn't the government providing us fuel at cheaper prices? We can afford the stove or something, or you would subsidize the stove or something. So instead of providing us with stoves, why aren't you providing us with LPG or some other fuel? So that even kerosene, people use kerosene fuel stoves in rural areas. So people even question that why are you providing us biomass stoves rather than providing us with kerosene stoves?
So it's in some sense a question for you of how needs are prioritized, right, in resource allocation. And it seems at that moment where you're thinking more that resources should be allocated towards infrastructure, long-term infrastructure. That seems right.
And the long-term infrastructure.
rather than sort of, I guess we'd say, short-term mitigation strategies, thinking about improving the entirety of the nation.
Gas stoves? Yes, if you see gas stoves, yes, probably it's a short-term investment because India is a developing country and probably more and more people will become, economically sufficient later on that they can afford LPG. Yeah, exactly, you can't define it to be a short-term strategy because we have a long way to go before that this thing happens, that every one of us, has come above the poverty level and every one of us can afford LPG and all this stuff. So we have a long way to go actually. In the last 50 years, we have probably the below poverty line has lowered, but still we have a long way to go. So we just can't. I think we can't say that it's a short-term strategy providing gas stoves. It's a long-term strategy indeed, but it's just that ethical issues rise up when you focus on these kind of things, whether to provide the poor with this or whether to provide the poor with that. Is it ethical to say that urban people should have access to clean water, LPG, but the rural people should have access to only biomass fuel stoves or clean drinking wells rather than having water supply to their homes? Like we people have direct water connection, we just open the tap and we can fill our glasses. So, but the rural population have to go to wells to collect their water. So, is it ethical to say that, okay, we'll be providing you with clean water, but it would be in only the well, or you would be provided stoves, but it would be fueled by biomass. We never talk of providing LPG gas stoves to the rural population or providing direct water connection to the rural population. So it's questionable. Is it ethical? Is it not ethical? And yes, of course, the economic feasibility, the question of economic feasibility also comes into question. Maybe economists who are working on this aspect would be, would be able to give a clearer view of this, of my, whatever I'm saying. And I might be wrong also. Maybe it's not economically feasible, that's why they are not focusing on that. But it's just that in the entire climate change discussion, it's always that, is it ethical? Like you have a CDM, clean development mechanism, where developed countries invest on projects in developing countries. So it is economically feasible. So people have accepted that, okay, we will be investing in projects in developing countries that help in reducing carbon dioxide. But there is another group of people who question, is it ethical to do so? It's like, corruption, buying your, right to pollute at a cheaper price, low-hanging fruit, by investing in projects in developing countries. So the question of ethics, the question of economic feasibility, economics is on a balance, like what to do, what not to do. So in the global discussion forum also discussions come up, the question of ethics and economics, and in India also there is this problem, what to do. Should we go for ethics or economics? Like Billy had said that there is a large displacement of people when we build dams. So people who are building the dam are saying we are providing electricity to this much number of people, to millions of people. So why to think about people, handful of people, like thousands of people who are getting displaced? But the people who are getting displaced, according to them, for providing electricity to millions of people, would you, put our lives at stake? Would you put our homes at stake? What have we done to, to deal with this? So there are two facets of the same thing. So people justify that it's economically feasible, that's why we are doing that. For the country to develop, that's why we are doing that. But when you see at the ethical level, it's not ethical at all. So it's just to say that ethics and economics have to be well balanced, and sometimes some people are at the losing side because of this tussle between ethics and economics.
it seems to me like you're suggesting that what we ultimately need to do is try to minimize the percentage of the vulnerable, most vulnerable, who end up on the losing side of these, you know. Because oftentimes I think what we hear in the West too is that the people who are making arguments about CO2 and historical emissions, those are people who are profiting enormously from those discussions. It's a little bit opaque what I'm saying, but we'll get to the point soon. Billy, I have a question for you that's related to this. We've been studying for the past 10 days or so about vulnerability and climate change. In our studies, what have you been discerning about who ends up impacted most significantly by climate change?
Well, it seems straightforward right away that the people who have the least wealth and the least access to resources are going to be the folks who get affected the most. I think, in the context of South Asia, this is going to be sort of the most, prominent thing that sort of comes alive. In India, about 68% of the population lives on $2 a day. And a lot of the folks are involved in local economies and sort of microeconomies, economies that just aren't censored or taxed by the government. Now, in Mumbai, there are it ranges. Some studies say that there are 14 million people who live here, and some say there's 20 million people. The reason for this range is just because the government doesn't really have a census bureau on how many folks actually live here. So the economy seems, as we've learned since we've been here, it's about 70% informal. And most of that informal economy is made up from the folks who are living on those $2 a day. So, in the context of a slum, such as Dharavi, they have a strong economic output of about $1 billion. They rely on resources to sort of, to get their operations out and running, to have sort of economic capacity, and to be able, they fulfill functions that, are mandatory for Mumbai, such as recycling and sort of pottery making, and a lot of the folks who, drive cabs are folks who, they're from Dharavi. And so the Dharavi is an example of a slum that has both economic and political power. They don't necessarily own the land they live on. The government could displace them, but the reason they don't, and they've tried before, is because Dharavi has political power. Now, if they want to sort of keep up these economic sort of microeconomies, they're going to need resources to keep on doing it. Roughly 2 hours a day can folks in Dharavi, and this is true for much of India, receive water and resources just to sort of thrive on. And in the context of climate change, in the context that monsoons may no longer provide the right water supply that's necessary for agriculture or water consumption, it threatens them. So.
Well, actually, just keep the mic, if you would. So we're thinking, on Krishna's side, it seems to be that one of the major fears is that in developing with climate change in mind, we're going to create basically a second tier of development, right? So that there's going to be a portion of the population that is not going to have access to the same resources. So essentially, a different type of case system. I guess the question then for us within this dialogue and in this conversation writ large is, and with you were talking about, and in Brazil, about how development oftentimes has many unintended negative consequences. Do we feel like that we need to, is climate change a priority, or is development a priority? How do those two things marry?
I think it requires just doing a co-construction of the two, to develop in accordance to climate change. And so they aren't necessarily two separate entities. For example, I spoke earlier about how a census sort of bureau is needed, and if India wants to, or if Mumbai, for instance, wants to understand its sort of microeconomies better, they'll have to figure out how to keep track of them, to document what sort of economy is working here, and what sort of resource do they need to work that economy. And so basically, if if Mumbai wants to be able to mitigate its sort of energy or greenhouse gases and still keep and be conscious of sort of these microeconomies that are around in Mumbai, then they're going to have to learn about these microeconomies and to understand how they work so that they can, mitigate, resources in accordance to sort of, that hit the underbelly and the majority of the population in Mumbai.
And I wonder what your opinion is on whether in India making climate change should be our priority and mitigation strategies.
Yes, climate change should be a priority, but we shouldn't compromise on development also. Because if we become stagnant economically, we would become more vulnerable if climate change drastically happens. So we have to develop, but since we already know that if we do these kind of things, if mitigation is not done, then climate change would maybe amplify. So India should take measures so that it develops, but considers climate change impacts also. It should, like it is doing, it should invest in renewables, maybe fuel switching, but it shouldn't, according to my perspective, it shouldn't compromise on development also. It's not like, since this industry will produce this much of carbon dioxide, we are not going to put up this industry. It shouldn't be like that. It should try its level best to mitigate climate change, like whatever it is doing, investing in renewables, but it shouldn't compromise on development also. So it should do its best, but it's not stop developing just because of climate change.
All right. I'm going to do my best to Phil Donahue impression and go out into the crowd. And I wonder what questions you guys might have for Krishna or Billy, or what types, we can just have our own conversation based on what we've learned thus far. Do we have any takers? We'll pass this around.
Thank you so much, first of all, for coming and speaking with us. Development and climate change is definitely a really important intersection to address. One of the things that I was wondering is, what do both of you think are some of the misunderstandings and misconceptions that the world has in terms of development and climate change?
I think the largest misconception, which I was sort of talking about earlier, is just the idea of dams in a large scale being a renewable resource. I think this goes along with pretty much every sort of resource of energy. If you put it on a large scale, it's gonna have a negative impact in some way. If you build a large geothermal plant, it's gonna go through sort of the resource faster, and it's gonna cause, it has a chance of causing earthquakes here and there. Like I said, dams release more emissions than a lot of coal plants just through the dead brush that sort of rises up, and a lot of that all the emissions sort of end up being methane, which we know is a strong one. Even if you have a large-scale solar plant, you have just a lot of the runoff from the water just going onto the solar panel. It could get a little intoxicated and then just go into the water as a sort of runoff consequence. The idea should be to not sort of centralize power into just one sort of resource that you rely on. If you rely on a dam too much and you have a drought, you have a lot of people with problems. Instead, you should sort of put emphasis on having 2% wind, 5% dam hydro, and go on those small increments. And I think that's something that it's sort of the next step that folks should really learn about.
I would say misconception on the policy side. The common misconception among people is that I'm saying the tussle between the West and the East. that the East blames the West that you have already emitted carbon dioxide carbon dioxide. So why should we stop developing? And the West is like, you would be developing in the future. India and China is the most populous countries. So you will be contributing in the future. So you should stop developing and stop emitting carbon dioxide. So that is a common misunderstanding between the two parties. It's just that at this hour, we just can't blame each other. It's not, if we have continued the blame game since the last 10-15 years, and if we continue to do so, we will be in a big mess. So it's high time that we understand that it's not a blame game. Both of us have to work together. The developing countries just can't say that we have to develop, so we won't be doing anything at all about climate change problem. They should try their best to do whatever they can, without compromising on development, of course. And the West, they have already developed, so they should, like it has happened in the international agreements, they should help the developing countries, the poorer countries, to come up with technologies, to invest in technologies, to invest in power plants so that they can mitigate their emissions, the climate change problem.
That's a sort of a question for you then. What are other things the West owes the East in terms of these historical emissions? Do you feel like anything? You mentioned sort of technologies or investments. Are there other things that the West can be doing to help the East?
Yes, probably technology transfer, investments in R&D to helping in adaptation, helping in mitigation. But of course, the West should look at their own benefits as well. Like the developing countries are saying, we will develop, we will work on climate change, but we still need to develop. I'm not saying the West should give their entire investment to the East so that they can, adapt and mitigate. But according to my perspective, the West is well endowed enough that they can give a small percentage of their, economics or finances to the developing countries. Like there has been talks of coming out with a green fund, a common green pool from which the developing countries can borrow or loan some money and invest in climate change problems, climate change adaptation or mitigation. I think that's the right way to do. It's just that the West has to bear it. It's not that they totally owe us money or something like that. But since they are like when we say that Tatas and Ambani should invest in corporate social responsibility, so maybe the West can invest some of their finances as a corporate social responsibility or whatever you can name it to solve the problems of adaptation and mitigation in developing countries.
I cannot speak loud.
Here, just use it. Humor me.
Okay. I'm not sure whether this is a perfect example, but in some cases, India, in some sectors, India don't want to develop. So I know South Korea may not be a Western country, but they are a developed economy. POSCO wanted to set up a big, huge steel plant in Odisha. Ministry of Forest and Environment, they never cleared the project. Mumbai airport is crowded. They wanted to develop a new airport. Again, Ministry of Forest and Environment, they never cleared the project. So wherever Ministry of Environment have been involved, the last state minister, he never cleared any project. So
the people are already
and
weighing.
I cannot forget her statement when she made in South Africa. Still resonates in my mind. I cannot sign on a blank check of the livelihood of 1.2 billion people. But she is signing by not clearing any of the project. And if POSCO would have come, Odisha is one of the most least developed states in this country, like Bihar. If POSCO set up a steel plant, they would have some employment, but they had to cut trees. So it's not necessarily wanted to develop all the time.
Okay, yeah, that's very interesting, right? So there's already being choices made about development.
Let me take that one step further here. So, do we even know, and I'll come to the US eventually, whether you even know it. Let's say in India, first, do we even know what to blame ourselves, anybody else for? Do we know what is needed? has enough work gone into that, or is it just based on ideology? So some environmental minister thinks this is not environmentally right, doesn't agree with what I think. What I think should be good for everybody, I don't sign it up. Somebody else thinks, no, my agenda is development. I sign everything that is development, and I don't care about environment, I have to be this way. Is there any thought? So let me give you an example. We heard a lot about monsoons. Many of us here heard a lot about monsoons. There is no direct attribution yet. There are some, but not enough evidence yet to link emissions, anthropogenic emissions related to climate change to monsoons. There were some, they have been refuted. There is enough evidence to say at this point that change is happening. A lot of that change might just come from regional issues, urbanization, land use. Some of that actually may come from greenhouse gas emissions. The jury is out about exactly how much. But let's say if India were to make a rational decision, besides looking at cut in energy emissions, or even first of all, besides even thinking about energy first, what about issues like urbanization, regional planning? That doesn't require any help from the West. That doesn't require any discussion with the West, that's just internal. So that's one question that I have. How much effort is going in there? Right? Just to try and understand. The second question is, or not question, comment is, so far, from my reading of history at least, history as in short term, long term, whatever, no aid comes for free. No aid from nowhere comes from free. Whether it's the World Bank, whether it's IMF, everything comes with a rider. Why would India want aid?
Two very pointed and good questions. Who would like to tackle this first? I'm gonna lean here, and then I'll pass the building.
Like I said, India wants to prove itself as to be an upcoming developing country. So it has even denied funds from international agencies that we don't need funds from international agencies to tackle our home problems like Cyclone Fallon or the Uttarakhand floods. I'm saying that India, on the face of it, doesn't want to take in funds, but I'm saying on a global level, the funds should be directed towards the developing countries. After that, India can maybe decide whether we want it or not, or at least, even if the funds are not, even if directly funds are not invested, maybe there can be technology transfer. Technology transfer is always an option. There can be collaboration between the West, the developed countries and the developing countries to come up. And India is a hub of great minds. So that can be a trade-off. People here can go to the West and research and come up with good projects so that they can help tackle this problem. So, and there can be some other policies, of course. Policymakers would be able to formulate them better. So in that way, there can be options where India or the developing countries is not a free rider. They can also contribute to this problem, and then in return they can ask for investments, or there can be technology transfer at a subsidized rate so that they can tackle the problem of climate change over here.
What about urbanization?
Urbanization, yes.
Why isn't there a focus on urbanization, land use and all those things first, before even thinking about energy?
Because on a global scale, everything, the climate change problem is attributed to carbon dioxide emissions. So India is also on the flow that okay, we have to on the global level they are saying yes, they never talk of urban planning and all those things. But when we go at a regional scale, they talk of urban planning, but I don't think it has much been implemented, urban planning and all, because just as I said, when there are urban hubs in India, there is a lot of migration problems. A lot of people from the rural places coming to, like these slums. In one day you just can't remove you just can't remove them from here and say we'll be urban planning, we'll be planting trees over these areas, we'll be making good sustainable houses with solar powered panels. You just can't say that to them, and of course it requires investments also. So on a global level, maybe India is just saying that we will be tackling the carbon dioxide problem. Like any other country, whenever there is a conference of parties after Kyoto Protocol, they have always focused on carbon dioxide emissions, introduction of renewables.
Which is probably why no protocol has ever led. This is just a hypothesis.
But yes, at a regional level, there have been plans of urban planning, urban management. Like Professor Monica Jain also gave that presentation. When we go to urban municipal bodies, there are plans, but I don't think it has been implemented to a very great extent or to a good level, because problems such as drainage, sewage problems, these are still there. But there has been, like in Bangalore, there has been some programs in earlier years that every flat that will be constructed in the future need to have solar panels. It was mandatory. And in Chennai also, they have a lot of water problem. They have water scarcity over there. So in Chennai also, the municipal body made it mandatory that you have to go for rainwater harvesting whenever you construct a house. So it has been, these kind of programs has been there at a very minimum, at a very lower level, but yes, it has not been a national debate probably.
So my point was not that we, and I'm using we as in India now,